Blender 4.1 is about to be released, and so in preparation for that, let's take a look at all of the new nodes and features coming to Geometry Nodes. Hi, yes, hello everyone, I'm Gavin.js. Let's hop into it. So I have to say, just right here at the top, I'm incredibly excited for this update because we've got so many new nodes that add so many features that honestly I've wanted in Blender from day one. A couple of which I've been surprised Blender hasn't added before, but I know that Geometry Nodes is one of the newer systems to Blender as a whole, so I'm just excited that they're here at all now. So let's discuss the new nodes that are being added, some of the nodes that are being updated, and some general changes to Geometry Nodes as a whole. And in order to talk about all of this, let's just jump right into Blender. I've got the newest release candidate. It was new as of a couple of days ago. I've been playing around, testing things out, making sure that I understand the release notes, because a lot of this stuff, as of recording, hasn't been added to the manual just yet. I've had to go through the docs and really figure out exactly what they mean, sort through the technical jargon, and test things to make sure that I understand these nodes so that I can share all of this information with you guys. I may cover things in a little bit more detail, or maybe some different detail that gets added to the manual later because of this, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm human, I make mistakes. With all of that said up front, let's take a look at some of the new nodes here. So to get us started, I'd like to look at all of the different nodes we have to switch now. We have 3 different switch nodes. We have the classic switch. It just has a true-false input and this Boolean toggle for switching. Of course, we can use this drop down here to change between all of the different data types, and it has our output, right? This is very standard. We've been using this for years. But up until 4.1, we've had to chain a bunch of these together in order to make more complicated switches, because it only has that true and false input. If you want anything more complicated, you have to do a lot more Boolean math, you have to do all kinds of craziness to get more inputs. It's been kind of frustrating for me, to say the least. So, to help remedy this, they've added the index switch and the menu switch, and there are a couple of differences between the two. The index switch I have been looking forward to forever. So to show you how this works, I've got a whole bunch of different primitives here, and what we can do is just start plugging these into our different inputs, and when we get down to this empty socket, we can just continue putting in inputs, which I'm incredibly excited about. We can just infinitely add in as many inputs as we want. Then we can use this index input to be able to switch between them. And if I plug this into our output here, we can see that I'm able to just scroll through all of the different inputs that I just set up, which is incredible. I'm very excited about this. It eliminates so much unnecessary complication to a lot of different node setups that I've had to work with in the past, and I know a lot of other people have had to do and set up in the past. This eliminates so much of this. And I do want to note that just like our switch node, it works with all different data types. We can plug that index into our group input so that we can access that in the modifiers panel. It's nice and easy to be able to just plug in additional geometry to, or whatever data type, to this empty socket. Very good node, a lot of great functionality. I'm very excited about this. But in addition to having this node, we have the menu switch node, which is very similar, but notably different. And I really want to showcase the menu switch here because I think for a lot of people who are just opening this up and playing around with nodes without really reading through any of the documentation, it's going to feel somewhat confusing, because while the menu switch is functionally the same as the index switch, it does not have an empty socket at the bottom here. So at face value, it looks like we can only plug in these 2 primitives. However, that is not the case. If we go up to the node panel in our side menu here, we can see, just like our group, we have this list of different inputs. So if we hit the plus here, we can now start adding items to our node. This is a lot less intuitive than with the index switch, which is somewhat unfortunate. I feel like this could be implemented in the same way, and I expect that in a future update they're going to change this around. My suspicion is that these two nodes were created by two different contributors trying to solve the same problem, which I have no problem with. That's fantastic. It just feels odd that they don't have the same implementation, but I'm happy regardless, because now we have this new data type called a menu. That is what this gray input is here. So it shows up wherever you've got it plugged into. So I've got this plugged into the group input. That means it'll show up in the modifiers panel. Let's take all of those nodes and group them together. And if we plug that menu input into our group input, we can now see that we've got that drop down available on our custom node. I'm super excited about these two nodes. I think they're gonna really revolutionize a lot of different node setups out there. So this is a fantastic update. Very excited about it. The next node I'd like to talk about is the active camera node. And I have to say, this is not what I expected when I first dropped this in. I expected it to look much more like the object info node. I expected to have all of this different information here on the node, because that is all of the relevant information, right? But like, clearly these two nodes are meant to work together. I've just never considered the object data type. Like, look at that little guy. Look at that little Oompa Loompa. I guess I'll be playing around with the object data type. This is super cool. We can do things based on where our camera is. We can do things based on the current view from our active camera. I think this is super interesting, and I think it has a lot of potential. I can't wait to play around with it. Next, we have the split instances node, and personally, I don't know when I'll use this, but I've said that before, and then eventually the nodes that I say I don't know when I'll use this, I end up using them once I understand them better. So we'll see where I end up implementing this node. But to get into what it does, essentially it takes a mesh, or really any geometry component. It takes that geometry and, based on a group ID, splits it into different pieces and then makes each of those pieces into an instance. Basically, you give it an ID. Here I've split it on faces. And based on that ID, it'll group those faces together, split them where that boundary is, and then each of those pieces become instances. So here I've instanced them onto a line with 2 points. We have two different groups, and they are both instances. Of course, it also has a selection input so that you don't have to do this on all of the geometry that you input, and you can output the group ID so that you're able to use that data later on in your network. And it works on all of these domains, so we don't have to split on faces. We can split on any of these element types. Next, I want to talk about the sort elements node, but in order to discuss it, I'd also like to talk about the changes to the viewer node. If we take a look at the viewer node here, it looks like nothing has changed, but we can actually use it to visualize data in text form in the viewport. What do I mean by that? If we go up here to our overlays options, hit the drop down and toggle under the viewer node section here, the attribute text. We can now use the viewer node to display information like the index of each of our elements. So if we plug that in, I'm pretty sure the auto tends to default to point, so let's just tell it point. But if we take a look at the viewports, we can see all of our indices have these teeny tiny little numbers next to them, which is fantastic. Let me just turn off the color in viewports, and now we can more clearly see all of these different numbers. And if we go down from point to edge, we can see the indices of all of our edges. We can use it for faces, whatever element type. Also, this works for any data type as well. So if we take our normal node and plug it into the viewer, currently we're only seeing one value. That's fine. If we select the viewer, go into the node menu here, under properties, we can change the data type that we're viewing. And if we switch that to vector, now we can see vectors associated with all of our different faces. Let's switch that back to points. And yeah, you can see all of the different normal values here associated with each of our points. This is fantastic, specifically for looking at the different indices of our elements, right? What's exciting to me is that not only can we see this finally in geometry nodes, they also mention in the development docs that this is just a rough implementation right now. They do intend to expand upon this in the future. So what does that have to do with the sort elements node? What it can do is allow us to sort our indices of any element type based on a sort weight. This is huge because generally speaking, at least my workflow has been to do some kind of math, create a new attribute or set my ID, and then based on that, do some kind of operation, right? We couldn't directly use the index if, say, we wanted to use the z component of our position. Obviously, you can just directly use the z component, but this is just an example. So now we're able to use this node to reorder everything in the spreadsheet. So let's look at what that means. I'm going to open up the spreadsheet. Up here, I've got our indices visible. So let's pull up a position node, separate XYZ node, and then plug our Z component into the sort weight. And immediately you can see that all of our indices are now reordered. If I toggle this node, you can see that index 0 is in the top right of our cube, and now it is in the bottom right. I've noticed that this node orders all of your elements from least to greatest, so in ascending order, and this is also reflected in the spreadsheet. So let me just toggle that one more time. You can see the index value doesn't move, but the points associated with it, the positions associated with it, are changing. So this is just cool. This is another option to be able to mess with your data, reorder things, and do different operations based on the index. We of course also have a selection input, so we can choose which elements we want to do this with, and we have a group ID. And according to the docs, the group ID allows you to sort elements by groups. So you'll have different chunks of elements in the spreadsheet. It'll take that whole chunk based on the ID and move all of those elements around based on that ID. A couple more notes on this node. It doesn't work on the corners domain, and if you sort elements in one domain, it may implicitly affect the order of elements in another domain. So if you sort your faces, then implicitly you would be sorting your points as well. Then the last new node we have to discuss is the bake node. I expect a lot of people are going to be really excited about this node because it allows us to store some cache data and read it back so that we don't have to calculate the entire geometry node network every time we make a change. It can store both animated and static data, but there are a couple of key notes I'd like to go over about this node that I don't think are going to be terribly intuitive for your general user. So something I expect a lot of users to notice is that the bake button itself is grayed out. Hopefully, you're saving your projects early and often, but because of some ambiguity as to where this node is going to save the cache data, Blender's not going to allow you to bake data until you have saved your project. So if I just do that real quick, we can see now the bake button is enabled. Like I said, this is because there can be ambiguity if the project hasn't been saved and it goes to save some cache data, but then you save and it may lose that data. So just to prevent that, they've made it so that you can't do that before you save. But this is also because currently there's no way to import or export this cache data to this node. That's pretty standard for other applications out there to be able to, load from a specific spot so that you can load data that you stored forever ago. You can load data from other projects, what have you. And the reason for this is that every version of Blender handles data differently. And so until that's been unified, they're just making it so that you can't do that, but that is something that'll be implemented in the future. There are a few more details as to why this is, but that's kind of the long short of it. So okay, I've talked a lot about some of the technical things here. What does this node actually do, right? What it does is creates a point in your node network at which we're going to calculate everything to the left of that node and store it so that all of that information doesn't need to be recalculated every time you change something for every frame that's being processed. It just exists, and you can adjust everything to the right of the node a lot faster. It should be a lot more performant, because if you have something really heavy that's being calculated but you're done messing with it, you can just drop down a bake node, bake that information, and then your computer won't have to worry about any of that information until you go to change it. And one more thing is they added this nice little graphic to show on the timeline when you have a baked animation. This only shows up when you use the bake node and you're baking an animation, not for anything that's just static geometry. But I think that's really nice to have that feedback showing when you have something that's baked across frames. Otherwise, there are a few more things I could say about this node, but then we'd be getting into the technical weeds, and I think that's enough for this first impressions sort of video. So I hope all of that makes sense. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, or if you find more things, or if I said something incorrectly. I may have misunderstood something. Let me know if I did. Then moving on, we have a few updates. So one that's pretty notable is the Musgrave texture. That has been replaced by the noise texture. Basically, all of the features of the Musgrave have been integrated into the noise texture, and so you should be able to use the noise texture as you would a Musgrave. And any old files that you open in this update will automatically have Musgrave textures replaced by the noise textures with the appropriate settings. So it won't break anything that you've made and choose to open with 4.1. That should all just work as expected. They've also replaced the rotate Euler node with a rotate rotation. I haven't played around with this much yet, but it looks like they're moving towards using the rotation data type instead of vectors for rotation. I need to investigate the rotation data type more anyway, so I don't want to cover that a ton here. Just know that there are several different nodes that they've changed the rotation input on to be that rotation data type. They've changed distribute points on faces, instance on points, rotate instances, transform geometry, object info, and instance rotation. So all of those use the rotation data type instead of a vector. They've also made a few changes to normals here and how that reflects in smooth or sharp geometry. I don't fully understand all of these changes, so I'm not going to go into detail just yet, but I'll probably talk about these in a future video. Just know that there are more options. I'll put all of the text up on screen so that you can read through it yourself. Did I say options? There have been changes. Give it a glance and see if that impacts your setup or your current understanding of smooth elements. We've also got some performance updates, which is really good. It seems like they've made several nodes that can be fairly heavy a lot faster for larger meshes, which is really nice. I appreciate that. And then some pretty big general changes to geometry nodes. As of 4.0, they added tools, but they were only available in edit mode. Now it looks like we're able to use tools at the object level, which is pretty neat. I like the added functionality there. They've changed around the panels in the Modifiers tab for geometry nodes. We now have a new Manage panel, which allows us to manage our bake information and our named attributes. And then they've also hidden the output attributes until you actually have output attributes, which is pretty nice. It just gets rid of some of that visual clutter. Anyway, that should be all of the major changes, at the very least, specifically for geometry nodes. I haven't talked about any of the other updates to Blender here because, I mean, geometry nodes are my focus. But be sure to look over the manual because there have been lots of changes to Blender as a whole. I just don't have time to go through literally everything at the degree of detail that I like to go through things. Anyway, that is all for this one. I appreciate you watching. If you've enjoyed and this has been helpful, please consider giving me a like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.